'70s witnessed great strides for African Americans in local politics. Coast to coast, voters had entrusted black men with the keys to their city, electing African Americans their mayor. It begged the question, what next? Ironically, it was an African American successful run for mayor of Chicago in 1983 that would prove to be a rallying call for the first serious run by an African American for a considerably higher office.
And it really started in a lot of ways over the two major Democratic contenders for president that year deciding to get involved in the mayoral race in Chicago. The Kennedy organization got behind one candidate, and the Mondale organization got behind another candidate. And a number of national African-American leaders were incensed that the Democratic establishment, so to speak, the progressive, liberal establishment of the Democratic Party in particular, would decide to go against a respected African-American member of the United States Congress, Harold Washington, who was running for mayor. And that, in a lot of ways, began discussions about maybe to get the respect that African-Americans ought to get, somebody ought to run for president.
After the Chicago mayoral election in April 1983, the African-American political leadership began a series of secret meetings across the country. Their purpose was to discuss what would be the most effective way to let the Democratic Party leadership know that African Americans could not be taken for granted.
There were meetings in Atlanta and Washington, in Chicago, and these were meetings that were secretive meetings. And Julian Bond was there, Andrew Young, Maynard Jackson. All of the national players on the scene were around and involved in saying how important it was for us to have a viable chance to have someone from the black community become mayor of Chicago.
It was decided that the best way to show the two frontrunners for the 1984 Democratic presidential nomination that the black community was a political force to be reckoned with was to give them a run for their money. A black man would run for the President of the United States, challenge the established norm, and change the landscape of presidential politics forever.
I'm not sure that Reverend Jackson at that time thought he'd be the candidate. There were discussions about whether or not Maynard Jackson or Andrew Young or someone else should run. Of course, nobody was really stepping up to the plate.
I tried to get Andrew Young to run. So he chose not to. He just left the UN. I tried to get Maynard Jackson to run. I think he had the requisite background. And he had been in corporate America for a while, so he wanted to stabilize his family financially. He didn't do it. So I said, somebody needs to do it.
Jesse Jackson was born on October 8, 1941, to a 17-year-old unwed high school student and her older middle-class neighbor, a married man. Jackson's ancestry included black slaves, a Cherokee, even a white plantation owner. Nurtured by his loving mother, grandmother, and stepfather, he grew up poor in a still segregated South.
I was born in Greenville, South Carolina during the Second World War. We lived under extreme conditions of racial segregation. It was illegal for a person of color to use a public hotel or motel or park or library unless the sign said colored and white. I never saw a black policeman or a black fireman during my entire childhood. Our schools were all segregated by race. And so race was the defining feature. We learned to survive within the context of our situation. We learned to survive.
From an early age, Jackson did more than survive. He excelled. In 1959, Jackson left the South to attend the University of Illinois on an athletic scholarship. During his first year, however, he became dissatisfied with his treatment on campus and on the gridiron, and decided to transfer to Greensboro's North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College, a predominantly black institution. There he was quarterback, honor student, fraternity officer, and president of the student body. After receiving his BA in sociology, he accepted a Rockefeller grant to attend the Chicago Theological Seminary, where he planned to train for the ministry. Jackson was ordained a Baptist minister in 1968, though he had not finished his coursework at CTS, having instead left in 1966 to commit full-time to the civil rights movement. His mentor was Dr. Martin Luther King.
I joined Dr. King's staff after Selma in 1965. I was with him until he was killed. I was in conversation with him when he was killed in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. It was a cold, bloody murder. So it was a very painful period for us. And yet, we would do the bound to keep going. keep fighting, to keep going forward.
After Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968, Jackson left the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to found Operation PUSH, People United to Save Humanity. Through PUSH, Jackson carried on the work of Dr. King by attacking the afflictions of the poor and powerless in America. And now, in 1983, 15 years after he held his dying mentor in his arms, Jesse Jackson was about to take Dr. Martin Luther King's dream into the race for the highest office in the land.
At some point, we were doing a Southern voter registration drive, and debate, should a black run, should a black not run, kind of ensued, because it was kind of novel at the time. Someplace down the road, someone said, "Run, Jesse, run," and it just got louder and louder.
I remember "Run, Jesse, Run." I do. And was so proud that finally an African American that appeared that could win was running for president.
Jackson had never run for public office, much less the President of the United States. Organizing a nationwide campaign proved to be a daunting task.
I had no preparations for a campaign. I really had no idea of how to put such a campaign together. Like, we had to go forward. Boy, and here we came with this whole new dynamic.
He clearly started out with a base, that base being the black community. But I think that he built on the dream that Martin Luther King had. Towards the end of Martin Luther King's life, what he was trying to do was broaden that base to a real poor people's campaign, people who were locked out of the process regardless of what color they were.
Jackson's idea of a rainbow coalition struck a chord with people of all colors who had been left behind by the establishment candidates. And his campaign reflected his unique message.
We went to Native American reservations, stayed on the reservations to give them a sense that they were a part of something. We went to barrios, we went to Appalachian whites, we stayed in the mountains, we stayed in people's homes. We took our campaign to people's houses, to their blocks, to their streets to make them come alive. And in some sense, that was part of our mission, was to build a coalition of interests where people had some things in common.
But when Jesse ran, he went to places that people didn't expect him to go. He went and spoke to farmers in Iowa and other poor and disenfranchised people that weren't always African American, and really made white America realize that we had more in common, particularly when we didn't have the resources, then that was different.
I first got involved in the 1984 Jackson campaign for president. I was inspired by him, inspired by his rhetoric, inspired by his values, and by the hope that he instilled in us for a better future.
We kind of knew the issues that had to be raised. We knew the issue of a free South Africa had to be raised at that time. We knew we had to fight the influx of guns and drugs into urban America, and there'd be some urban policy to reinvest in America. So we kind of staked out some territory. But we also inspired people's imagination.
Jackson's appeals for social programs, voting rights, and affirmative action for those neglected by the status quo earned him strong showings in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, New York, Louisiana, and Washington, D.C. His voting registration drive logged in an estimated 2 million new voters. In the end, he received 3.5 million votes, enough to secure a measure of power and respect at the Democratic Convention.
2 million new registered voters. And the impact of that was dramatic.
And it was an exciting campaign for many. And I remember, I believe that was my very first Democratic convention. I remember the excitement that was there in the halls of the convention, in part due to his candidacy.
The campaign catapulted into a crescendo that nobody ever dreamed about. I suspect that even people who were very much a part of Reverend Jackson's inner circle were surprised at just how well he did.
Jesse Jackson had made history. 12 years earlier, African-American Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm had run for president, but she hadn't won any primaries. In 1984, Jackson had won 5. He had demonstrated to a skeptical America that yes, it could be done. But some people thought that his run and success was a one-time event. After all, in 1984, the very popular Ronald Reagan was running for his second term. In the general election, Reagan destroyed the Democratic nominee, Walter Mondale, by winning every single state except Mondale's home state of Minnesota. In 1988, the thinking went, things would be different. People would be taking this election more seriously. And that proved to be good news for Jesse Jackson. He ran again, and this time, he didn't surprise the political naysayers. He astonished them.
By 88, Reverend Jackson had expanded that rainbow into a much more colorful array of political support than anybody dreamed of. He did very well in the Hispanic community. He pulled together a real poor people's campaign. I mean, he had folks from Appalachia, anybody who could relate to being the underdog and having a chance to be a part of the mainstream ended up getting on Reverend Jackson's program. The environmentalists, all those folks who needed a voice for their issues, they had one in him.
Jackson's 1988 campaign for the Democratic nomination built on the successes of his first run with more organization and more funding. Now a seasoned candidate, Jackson and his Rainbow Coalition swung into action with an aggressive, well-oiled campaign that would prove to the media and the political pundits that Jesse Jackson was indeed a serious contender for the nomination. After early respectable losses in Iowa and New Hampshire, he won 5 southern states on Super Tuesday, March 8, 1988. On March 12th, he won in his birth state of South Carolina, and 3 days later, finished second in his home state of Illinois. But on March 26th, Jackson stunned Dukakis and the rest of the nation in Michigan. He won that northern industrial state with an impressive 55% of the vote, and with that, Jackson, an African-American descendant of slaves, became the frontrunner for the Democratic nomination for the President of the United States.
It really was a galvanizing point in American politics. A tremendous number of young people around the country who worked in that campaign ended up holding political positions.
Well, I think he surprised the nation. I wasn't surprised. I was working on that campaign, and I was because I believed in him, and I thought his message was one of hopefulness and one of inspiring us to do more for one another.
And I think that whether he won or lost, in a sense he won. And he also set a new pace for those who are African American to become candidates. When we started a few years ago, there were 3 African American congresspeople. Now we have 40.
Our campaign served as a connection point, and people began to emerge in all these dimensions for the reservations, the barrios, Appalachia. And to me, that is the great lasting joy of the campaign. We were able to arouse a new coalition of conscience.
The 20th century had begun with lynchings and Jim Crow laws. And now, as it prepared to enter its final decade, an African American had achieved the unthinkable. He had run for and had come close to winning the highest office in the land. Freedom's song would never be the same.